History books may record February 2022 as the beginning of an invasion, but on this cold morning in 2026, the data whispers a far darker truth: an empire is dragging itself into demographic suicide beneath the rubble of its own ambitions. In the muddy trenches along the front line today, it is not only soldiers who are being buried, it is an entire nation's next century that is being interred in the soil. What the Kremlin calls a special military operation has transformed, at unprecedented speed in modern Russian history, into a deliberate project of dehumanization. Today we are not merely examining military maps, we are dissecting horrifying statistics that are literally altering the genetic future of a country, and explaining, using the Kremlin's own data alongside independent reports, why Moscow will not recover for a full century. What you are witnessing is not just a war diary, it is a slow-motion documentary of a civilization's collapse. Russia has fallen into a human grinder whose scale, when expressed in numbers, freezes the blood. As of the final quarter of 2025, independent observers and defense ministries report that Moscow's daily losses have consistently exceeded the critical threshold of 1,000 people. This figure is not merely military attrition, it means that every morning Russia loses a battalion, every week a division, and every month a small city is erased from the map. Yet the real tragedy lies in the quality of these losses. The men being fed into the front line are no longer primarily professional soldiers. They are prisoners pulled from jails, unemployed men drowning in debt, and middle-aged civilians who had never before held a weapon. Putin's strategy, now immortalized in military literature as the meat grinder, seeks to overwhelm Ukrainian defensive lines through sheer numerical superiority while simultaneously annihilating Russia's most productive workforce, the fertile male population aged 20 to 40. The depth of the demographic crisis echoes louder than the gunfire in the trenches. Russia was already struggling with a population crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This war has turned that wound into gangrene. In 2024 and 2025, birth rates in Russia fell to their lowest levels since World War II. The deaths of young men at the front, combined with hundreds of thousands fleeing mobilization abroad, have wiped out an entire generation of potential fathers. The most fundamental indicator of a nation's future is the sound of children, yet today, in Russia's provincial towns, only the silence of funeral processions prevails. United Nations agencies and various demographic institutes project that by 2100 Russia could lose nearly half its current population. This is a far heavier price than winning or losing any war. It is the erasure of a nation's very reason for existence. How does this human loss affect the economy? Although the Kremlin can show paper growth by increasing military spending, this is actually a death spiral economy. Factories no longer produce for civilian needs, they churn out tanks and shells that will be destroyed on the front within hours. Skilled engineers, programmers, and doctors are either dying as ordinary infantry at the front or fleeing to the west to use their talents elsewhere. Russia's industrial and technological base is inevitably being set back by decades. Western sanctions have not only financially isolated Russia, they have mentally severed it from the world. Dependence on China is no longer strategic partnership, it is rapidly becoming raw material colonialism. Russia sells its energy resources cheaply to the East and receives in return technology barely sufficient to survive day to day. The societal damage is irreversible. The release of hardened criminals from prisons, many now returning with severe war trauma, has the potential to turn Russian streets into crime scenes. When heroes, who were once convicts, come home, the rule of law gives way to the rule of brute force. The education system has been transformed from teaching mathematics and science into an ideological propaganda machine glorifying the holiness of war. An entire generation is growing up not to compete with the rest of the world, but to live in isolation and hatred. This is the clearest evidence that Russia cannot become an innovation or scientific center for the next 100 years. Ukraine's resistance is not merely a military success, it is a mirror exposing the bankruptcy of an entire system. Ukrainian resolve, combined with Western technological support, has shattered the myth of Russia's invincible army. The Russian military has proven itself incapable of coordinating modern warfare. Logistically cumbersome, riddled with corruption in its command structure, and reliant on emptying 1950s-era depots because modern equipment is being destroyed faster than it can be produced. Virtually every serious military analyst now accepts that a doctrine that treats human life so cheaply has no chance on the high-tech battlefields of the 21st century. In conclusion, when the tragedy on Ukrainian soil finally ends, the Russia that remains will not be the great empire Putin once dreamed of. Instead, it will be a demographically collapsed, economically reduced to satellite status, and morally isolated, geographical giant, but human dwarf. When the Russian people finally realize that their leaders mortgaged their future for short-term territorial greed, it may already be far too late. Every shell fired in this war steals a piece of Russia's future. This crisis is not growing across oceans or on the other side of a border, it is growing in the very heart of Russia itself, and it will create the greatest geopolitical wreckage of the coming century. History has never forgiven leaders who squandered their own people for nothing, and the data of 2026 proves that forgiveness will never come. Viewing this table merely as a pessimistic forecast would be to ignore the stark mathematical reality on the ground. What Russia faces today is not simply a military failure, it is a state consuming the most fundamental fuel required for its own survival, human capital. What keeps a country standing is not the wheels turning in its factories or the drills pumping oil from its wells. It is the minds that turn those wheels and the new generations that will carry the added value of that oil into the future. Yet what we see in Russia today is a demographic black hole. The Kremlin's mobilization decrees and compulsory conscriptions under the banner of defending the homeland are, in truth, shackles placed on Russia's development potential. When a top graduate engineer from one of Russia's best universities dies in a trench from a drone strike, the country does not lose merely one soldier, it loses 30 years of accumulated technological capability. As these losses accumulate, Russia's claim to be a self-sufficient superpower will give way to the reality of a cumbersome entity struggling just to survive. On the economic plane, the process of satellization has already reached an irreversible point. With all bridges to the west burned, Moscow has been left defenseless before the rising giants of the east, reduced to little more than a raw materials depot. An arms industry that cannot produce its own technology and must strip chips from washing machines, how can it possibly compete on the autonomous and digital battlefields of the 21st century? The answer is simple, it cannot. While Russia attempted to weaponize its energy card, it actually weakened its own hand at the table. Today, Russian natural gas and oil are no longer dominating the markets they once commanded, instead, they are being sold at far lower prices into Asian markets out of necessity. This represents the gradual surrender of Russia's economic sovereignty. And what of the great silence into which the Russian people have been forced? From a sociological perspective, a society held together by repression and censorship inevitably builds pressure that must one day explode inward. The victory fairy tales broadcast on television today will eventually collide with the harsh reality of fathers who never return home, children left orphaned, and wallets that remain empty. When that happens, the grand imperial illusion will crumble like a sandcastle. As of 2026, Russia is on the verge of losing not only an external war, but an internal war over identity and future as well. In conclusion, the landscape before us is this: a state that gains territory by losing people ultimately gains nothing. A generation sacrificed for a few kilometers of strategic ground will become the dead weight that pushes Russia out of the global game for the next century. This is not merely Ukraine's victory, it is the beginning of the tragic end that Russia has prepared with its own hands. History will remember this period as the Great Delusion, and the price will be paid not only by those alive today, but by generations of Russian children yet unborn, for decades to come. The bottom of this abyss for Russia is not merely the declining population figures, it is the complete evaporation of the state's fundamental operating mechanisms, merit and rationality. Today, in the corridors of the Kremlin, the only unit by which military success is measured is square meters, while the brainpower paid as the price for that land is not even taken into account. Yet in the modern world, a state's power is not measured by the expanse of territory it occupies, but by the added value it can generate on that territory. Russia, however, is today trading the 21st century competition in software and technology for the 19th century obsession with territorial expansion. Let's look closer at the numbers. Since the beginning of the war, the number of highly qualified individuals who have either fled Russia or lost their lives has exceeded 1.5 million, according to independent reports. This figure is not just a statistic, it represents the breaking of the backbone of Russia's IT, engineering, medical, and aerospace sectors. You cannot replace an IT specialist or a geneticist with a convict released from prison. This irreplaceable loss is confining Russian industry to a form of technological archaeology. While modern machine tools are being replaced by relics from the Soviet era in factories, Russia is turning into an isolated open-air museum cut off from the world. What about economic dependence? Moscow has demolished the model of mutual interdependence with the West and shifted to a model of unilateral surrender toward the East. Today, the Russian economy has entered a phase in which Beijing dictates energy prices, restricts technology transfers, and positions Russia purely as a raw materials satellite. The rising proportion of yuanization in the foreign exchange reserves of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation is the most concrete evidence of this handover of economic sovereignty. Russia is no longer playing its own game, it is merely trying to survive by sacrificing pawns on a board set by others. On the societal level, the situation is even more dire. An entire generation is being imprisoned within a war culture. The instrumentalization of the education system for propaganda, indoctrinating children with militarism instead of mathematics and art, is the true dark move that mortgages Russia's next century. A society that does not question but only obeys may provide soldiers for the front line in the short term. In the long term, however, it pushes the country out of the global race of civilizations. By occupying the minds of its own children today, Russia is legitimizing its own end. The truth is this: territorial gains are an illusion if you no longer have a future to cultivate and honor that territory. Every explosion in Ukraine is not only shattering Russia's ammunition, it is also shattering its honor and global respectability. History will record this period as the suicide of an empire. The window to Europe that Peter the Great once opened is today being sealed with concrete by the Kremlin itself. Russia is no longer just a country. It is the name of a colossal tragedy drowning in its own ambitions. Do you believe a state's silent war against its own people can be covered up by territorial gains? Is it already too late for Russia to turn back from this historic mistake? Let us continue reading the future together in the light of these cold figures and leaked analyses. Truths are bitter, but knowing them is the greatest power.